recreate 2.py. I started rewriting the recreate in Python. So this is recreate 2.py. So let's just go to, okay, I'll go to this new code function.
Okay.
So this is the new code function in Python. And in C, I more or less did a translation from the Python one to the C one. Obviously, it's not a direct translation. Some of the things I kind of changed. But most of them were basically more or less the same workflow between the two versions. So so the difference is, first I had this parsing kind of interleaved in the processing code, which was not the case in Python. In Python, I first parsed the things and then fed the results that were parsed into this function.
Okay.
But for C, I decided to have the processing function do the parsing right inside of it, for performance reasons. So this is like, whereas the Python version, I have a heap ID, which I renamed it to address over here. I have a file name, I have a name. This is like saying, hey, parse the heap ID, parse the file name. And then when you parse the file name, it goes into this file name variable. These are output parameters.
Okay.
Like I pass these things in, but internally it actually sets the value over here. So these are output parameters. I developed this pattern, this call thing that's a macro. I developed this pattern for general error handling, similar to exceptions. C does not have exceptions. I sort of built my sort of poor man's version of exceptions in a way, using this technique. I can talk about that later.
Okay.
That might take a while. Okay, so this is all parsing. This parse var string args, it actually parses a whole list of string arguments. And in Python, I do it like that over here. But in C, I do it like this. So these 3 lines correspond to these 3 lines. And then this is a database call. Okay. Actually, this whole thing is a one database call. And we're inserting a fun code here. We're using the insert fun code statement to make a database call, and so it's equivalent to this block here.
Okay.
Yeah, this is, so in the Python you can see the shorthand, which is these are all parameters. These question marks are the parameters, and we'll substitute these values into them. In C, I have to say bind the first one at index 1, bind the second one at index 2, bind the third one at index 3. And each time I say bind, I have to tell it what type that data is.
Interesting.
So it's more manual and tedious, obviously. And also I had to write here, if I want null to be represented instead of an empty string, let's say, that I need to say bind null instead of bind text. Whereas in Python, that happens automatically internally. I could have written like a helper function that'll do this automatically as well.
So where does the bind null or bind text come from? Are these like functions that you wrote, or where?
This is this ends up being a a function from the SQLite library.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And this SQLite macro is another macro that just does a little bit of error handling.
What
Like,
is a macro?
what is a macro? Oh boy, I should probably defer that topic, but to summarize what a macro is, it's like it just rewrites your code basically. Let me show you, and this is a big thing in C. It's kind of a big thing in Lisp too, but the Lisp people will tell you our macros are way better than C's macros because C's macros are broken. Let me show you where that macro is. Oh, I'll just search for SQLite. Define SQLite. There it is. Okay. So when I call SQLite, it's not a function call. Instead, it's a macro expansion. And what that means is, this is I think a good way to explain macros is it's syntactic sugar. Yeah.
Okay.
This is syntactic sugar because this is just syntax expansion. It'll replace this with this.
Oh, okay.
Before, yeah, it's like a it's sort of like you know how TypeScript just
Like
rewrites the TypeScript into JavaScript, or CoffeeScript just rewrites the CoffeeScript
oh,
into
okay.
JavaScript.
Gotcha.
This all this does is replaces this syntax with this syntax. It expands it, so it ends up looking like that. But then it'll swap in the dynamic bits, and the dynamic bit is the F, so it becomes like that. And
Okay.
this pound sign in front of the F means, hey, stringify that thing,
Okay.
and so forth. So me writing this just magically becomes that.
Okay.
Yeah, every time. So so there's a little bit of error handling code here, and that's sort of the mechanism I'm using to build this sort of like a exception handling system.
Okay.
Yeah, so that every time I do that, it's actually a huge block of code, or a block of like 8 or 10 lines every single time here.
Okay.
So this actually, if I hadn't done this code would be so much longer, because every time I do one of these, it's like 8 lines of code, right? You can imagine how long this file would end up being.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
and the call is a similar deal where I have 3 or 4 lines after calling this function to do error handling. So yeah, this file would get really, really long if I hadn't done this trick.
So what's the difference between this and like a function? Between macro and just a function? I mean, you can have a function that takes in a function.
In some cases, you cannot.
Okay.
In some cases, you cannot. For example, I want to return. I have a return statement. Well, I can have a function, but that function is going to return from itself, not from where I am in this scope, right?
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Or I'm inside of a while loop, and I want to put a break there. Well, a function cannot break. Inside of the function, it's not in a while loop, right? There's actually many situations where you actually cannot write it as a function, and but the macro expansion, all it's doing is like replacing your syntax with a new piece of syntax with a little bit of replacement, right?
So it keeps the original scope. That's the biggest difference.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, gotcha.
So yeah, that's important, but it's also like very two-edged feature using this macro thing, because it's difficult to debug.
oh yeah, you can do crazy things in here in the macro and it's somewhere else and it's like you don't know where
Yeah,
it breaks.
yeah. It's kind of in some companies it's actually frowned upon. Although I see it, I looked at various source code in open source, and they actually do some crazy magic with macro. A lot of the large, like I looked at the V8 JavaScript engine, and they
Uh-huh.
have some crazy hacks that use macro. And also there's more fancy features in macros too. I'm actually using very basic stuff right now.
Mhm.
You can do much crazier stuff with it. In the Python source code, they use some macro hacks as well. Um, so this is, if you get into like the C code in the C world, or a lot of open source code is in C or C++, you'll see some stuff, and it is kind of hard to debug because you can't just it's harder, not that you can't, it's harder to track the code. Like you're like, oh, where is this function defined? Sometimes there's a macro that defines a function, you know.
Oh, okay. And
You can have you can write like, you know, you can write define my event handler like that, right?
then
Blah. And that actually generates a function entirely. And then, because all it is syntax expansion, right?
uh-huh.
So then you're like, oh, I see this, you're calling this function here, but I don't see where it was defined. It was defined by this macro that defines functions.
Hmm.
There's some crazy stuff like that that you can do, which is nice in one way, but not nice in that it makes it harder for people to debug later on.
That's true. Yeah.
Yep.